Please take your seats if you would. This is going to be the second installment of four that are following up on the civics theme that we're doing in conjunction with St. Thomas More Society of Orange County, which is represented today by Fabio Cabezas, who's here with us. We had asked Judge Bells to speak today on the separation of powers that are articulated in the first three articles of the U.S. Constitution. Judge Bells is in Monterey speaking at a mediators conference, was not able to fulfill that obligation, so he delegated it to his co-founder of the chapter, Greg Weiler. Unfortunately, Greg has been underneath the weather with this terrible flu cold that's been going around that seems to have gotten everybody. So I finally talked to Greg last day. He'd just come back from the dead, and he's like, there's just no way I can get out of bed. All right, no problem. So I think what we're called to do today is to do what the citizens did 200 plus years ago, which was to read the Constitution themselves as citizens of this new nation. Now remember, last month we had Patrick Lawrence here who was talking about the Declaration of Independence and what that meant in terms of the founders articulating the reasonableness of declaring our independence as individual states rather than colonies, and what the usurpation of our rights were at that particular time, 249 years ago. After 9 years of warfare and the conclusion of the War for Independence, the fledgling states were organized under what was called the Articles of Confederation, which were not really a perfect governing document. And so they convened the Constitutional Convention, and that's when the U.S. Constitution was really argued through from state over state over state. And really the Constitution, as it was written then 12 years after the independence, has been the governing document that the country has been operating with now for 200 plus years. So that's kind of the setup for what we're going to do today. Now, how many people have a device, some sort of a phone or some sort of an iPad? Anybody? Does everybody have something? Does anybody not have one with them? Who doesn't have? All right, if you have one, go ahead and look up the U.S. Constitution right now. Just look it up, because we're going to go through the first three articles. And we're going to incorporate and recruit some of our trade students to help us with this. So once you've all got it popped up, let me know. Fabio.
Mark, if I may just mention,
sure.
I am not the only lawyer here. Mr. Zita is here, who's also a lawyer.
Mr. Zita is here as well. All right, Mr. Zita, welcome. Glad to have you here. All right, so what I think we'll do is we'll start over here with Brandon. There's Pocket Constitution. If you want to look up the preamble, everybody go to the preamble. And Brandon, what we'll do after, I'll open it up at the preamble, and then I'll throw it to you for the section 1, article 1. And we'll just kind of work through it. Now remember, when the Constitution was written, it was written by delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And of the 13 colonies, everybody was present with the exception of one state, states rather than colonies, one state, which was Rhode Island. So delegates from Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and Georgia were present. They needed 9 states to ratify, and 12 were present when the document was signed. The president of the Constitutional Convention was George Washington, who was a member of the Virginia delegation. And so as the Constitution was written, the first 3 articles deal with the separation of the powers. So we have the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. Those are the first 3 articles which we're going to be reading through today. So do you have your Constitution ready to go? Okay, great. So the Constitution of the United States. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Article 1, Section 1. Mr. Trout?
All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of the Senate and House of Representatives.
So bicameral legislation, a House of Representatives, which were, as we'll see, were elected for 2-year terms, and a Senate, which was elected for 6-year terms, the lower house and the upper house. Again, the idea being that the lower house, the House of Representatives, would be the common man, that we would leave wherever we happen to be. And I remember the population of the 13 colonies was just around a little over 4 million people, not including enslaved people at that particular time, and we'll address those issues as well. But there was a great distance, and so for you to serve in the legislature, in the new federal government, it meant a great sacrifice for a citizen to go and represent his district. And so to be gone from your business, your farm, your mercantile establishment, wherever you happen to be, was a great sacrifice for a citizen to go to represent. The Senate was, the upper house had a longer term. Those were typically men of property who could take the time to be away from their homes to represent. And the legislature was not in session for the entire year like it is now. That's a relatively new phenomenon where we have a permanent government in place all the time. You know, the funny part is, it really was a result of air conditioning. It wasn't until air conditioning went to Washington, D.C. that the government didn't have to get out of town for the broiling summer heat. And so as a result of that, they were able to stay, didn't have to leave, and then that meant government was really more in session than it otherwise would have been, which were relatively small at this particular time. Okay, Jacob, why don't you take Section 2?
The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained the age of 25 years, and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may include within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all other persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of Congress of the United States, and within each subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall be, as shall by law direct. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least 1 representative. And until such enumeration shall be made, the state of New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3, Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations 1, Connecticut 5, New York 6, New Jersey 4, Pennsylvania 8, Delaware 1, Maryland 6, Virginia 10, North Carolina 5, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. When vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies. The House of Representatives shall choose the Speaker and other officers. They shall have sole power of impeachment.
All right, so let's just go back to one line here that was actually pretty important. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included within this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons. Okay, remember we had not only slavery at this particular time, but including those bound to service for a term of years. Does anybody know what that might refer to? Indentured servitude. Can somebody give me a working definition of what an indentured servitude would be?
An immigrant who was shipped over, and the cost of transportation was borne by the representative within the United States. The immigrant would be bound to serve typically 7, maybe 10 years to work off the cost of transportation.
Okay, so these guys are having to deal with people that aren't fully free, people that have the potential to be free, people that are enslaved. We got to figure this one out. Remember, it's an agricultural South. A lot of people in bondage that aren't going to be free. They don't anticipate it at this time period. And excluding Indians not taxed. That's remember, you've got these frontier Indians that we had just dealt with the French and Indian War, and then during the War for Independence, the British were trying to utilize the frontiers, and then you have Napoleon who's dealing with the Mississippi River Valley. You have the Spanish Empire that still has positions in Florida. So all of these issues are having to be thought through and talked about at this particular time of the convention. Okay, section 3, who do we have over here? Who's got it? Okay, Tony?
Section 3. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Immediately after they shall be assembled in consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the 2nd year, of the 2nd class at the expiration of the 4th year, and of the 3rd class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every 2nd year. And if vacancies happen by resignation or otherwise, during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years, and been 9 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote, unless they be equally divided. The Senate shall choose their other officers, and also a President pro tempore, in the absence of the Vice President, or when he shall exercise the office of President of the United States. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be an oath or affirmation. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office, and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States. But the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law.
Okay. So in that early, when they're talking about the terms of the 3 classes of Senate, basically they didn't want the Senate to have to reload every 6 years, so they ramped it up with this 2, 4, and 6, and then every 2 years, and so that's how the Senate terms happen. Interesting that they would go through and talk about the impeachment because they were so concerned about the power of an executive that the power of the legislature would be co-equal and equally empowered to prevent from a strong single executive coming in. Historically, Andrew Johnson was the first impeachment. Certainly not in our lifetimes. President Nixon was the threat of impeachment that led to his resignation. And then it was really President Clinton's impeachment and the trial in the Senate in our lifetime that really showed how these rules were operating and the proper responsibility of the House and what was involved in terms of political price that they would have to pay if they impeached, and then the rules in the Senate in terms of where the trial was put on, and the role of the Chief Justice in terms of adjudicating that. In that particular case, he was tried, not convicted, so therefore not removed. So these are amazing that 200 plus years later, we're still operating from the same rule book and that the rules have held. All right, section 4.
The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof. But the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations, except as to the places of choosing senators. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day.
All right, again, this reinforces the importance of the state legislatures. We're not only creating a central government in terms of how we're going to operate as a union, but the power and responsibility of the states was absolutely wanting to be protected because they just fought this bloody civil war where they didn't want to be recolonized. And so they wanted to make sure that the state legislatures had responsibility and authority over who was representing the states. Section 5?
Each house shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business, but a smaller number may adjourn from day to day, and may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members in such manner and under such penalties as each house may provide. Each house may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3 expel a member. Each house shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy. And the yeas and nays of members of either house on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. Neither house during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the two houses shall be sitting.
Okay, so the House and the Senate have their own rules for how they're going to govern their particular behavior, how they'll manage themselves. There was an example recently of a House member being censored. Did you see any of that? There was somebody that made a disruption during a joint session, and that then became a point for the Speaker of the House to discipline him, at which point he was censored. What does that mean? Well, it means the House member would then present himself in the well before the Speaker in order to have the censure read. What was interesting in that particular, there was a show of solidarity in that particular member who brought other members who were basically protesting the censure. So again, the House has its own rules and its own way of doing business inside the political body. This is a healthy tension that goes on when one minority party feels that it's being bullied by the majority party or not. Len?
Yeah, a key part about the meaning, the party of slavery started to sing "We Shall Overcome," the famous Negro ritual.
It made great theater. It was, we're learning so much through this whole process. This is why this is important to go through. Okay, section 6.
The senators and representatives shall receive a compensation for their services to be as certain by law and paid out of the Treasury of the United States. They shall, in all cases except treason, felony, and breach of the peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of the representative houses, and in going to and returning from the same, and for any speech or debate in either house, they shall not be questioned in any other place. No senator or representative shall, during the time for which he was elected, be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States, which shall have been created, or the emoluments whereof shall have been increased during such time, and no person holding any office under the United States shall be a member of either house during this continuance in office.
Okay, so they get paid, number one, rendering a service, so they're obviously entitled to remuneration. The privilege of not being arrested. This is powerful because that gives you the freedom of speech. You can speak your position without fear of a reprisal either coming to or from. Remember, they had to travel by road, et cetera, wasn't necessarily safe. So they're secure in their persons, but they're also told you can't double dip. If you represented us, you can't be doing something else where you'd be under the authority of the executive branch or something like that. Okay, section 7.
All bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments as on other bills. Every bill which shall have passed the House of Representatives and the Senate shall, before it becomes a law, be presented to the President of the United States. If he approves, he shall sign it, but if not, he shall return it, with his objections to the House in which it shall have originated, who shall enter the objections at large on their journal, and proceed to reconsider it. If after such reconsideration 2/3 of the House shall agree to pass the bill, it shall be sent, together with the objections, to pass the other House, by which it shall likewise be reconsidered, and if approved by 2/3 of that House, it shall become a law. But in all such cases, the votes of both Houses shall be determined by yeas and nays, and the names of the persons voting for and against the bill shall be entered on the journal of each House respectively. If any bill shall not be returned by the President within 10 days, Sundays expected, after it shall have been presented to him, the same shall be a law in like manner as if he had signed it, unless the Congress by their adjournment prevented its return, in which case it shall not be the law. Every order, resolution, or vote to which the concurrence of the Senate and House of Representatives may be necessary, except on a question of adjournment, shall be presented to the President of the United States, and before the same shall take effect, shall be approved by him, or being disapproved by him, shall be repassed by 2/3 of the Senate and the House of Representatives, according to the rules and limitations prescribed in the case of a bill.
Okay, so here we're dealing, number one, with the power of the purse which resides in the lower house. Okay, the ability to pass a budget, which requires taxation, revenues being generated from tariffs, et cetera. So this is the unique position of the House of Representatives. And then it describes the way that a bill moves forward in terms of being passed into law, and the role of the Senate or the House and the executive in terms of passing the law. All right, Section 8.
Article 1, Section 8. The Congress shall have the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States, but all duties, imposts, and excises shall be uniform throughout the United States, to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with Indian tribes, to establish a uniform rule of naturalization and uniform laws on the subject of bankruptcies throughout the United States, to coin money, regulate the value thereof, and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures, to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States, to establish post offices and post roads, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries, to constitute tribunals inferior to the Supreme Court, to define and punish piracies and felonies committed on the high seas and offenses against the laws of nations, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water, to raise and support armies, but no appropriation of money to that use shall be for a longer term than 2 years, to provide and maintain a navy, to make rules for the government and regulation of the land and naval forces, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, suppress insurrections, and repel invasions, to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States, reserving to the states respectively the appointment of the officers and the authority of training the militia according to the discipline prescribed by Congress, to exercise exclusive legislation in all cases whatsoever over such district not exceeding 10 miles square, as may by cession of particular states and the acceptance of Congress become the seat of government of the United States, and to exercise like authority over all places purchased by the consent of the legislature of the state in which the same shall be for the erection of forts, magazines, arsenals, dockyards, and other needful buildings, and to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers, and all other powers vested by this Constitution in the government of the United States, or in any department or officer thereof.
Okay, so again, we're dealing with issues of interior. We don't want a standing army. We don't want, the states are responsible for their defense, et cetera, but they need to operate in a unified fashion. So they're very concerned about the threat of standing armies, but the authority of local militias where the citizen army will come from. However, the Navy needs to be maintained because this is where the international commerce is taking place. And piracy is a big issue at this particular time, not only in places like the Barbary Pirates, but also privateers, which are basically subcontractors by nations that are, seizing ships and cargoes, et cetera. So the Navy, super important in this particular issue. District of Columbia, you got 13 states, and they're saying we need to have a central place that isn't beholden to any particular state, and so that's where the federal district is coming from. Does anybody know where the land came from for the District of Columbia? Virginia and Maryland, okay? Interesting, when I'm reading the biography of Charles Carroll right now, does anybody know Charles Carroll of Carrollton? Has you ever heard of that name? The only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the wealthiest person in all of the colonies. The amount of land holdings and businesses that they were involved in Maryland over 2 generations of Carrolls had positioned them to be literally the wealthiest person in the entire 13 colonies. And he had more at risk in terms of throwing in for independence. His cousin, John Carroll, a priest who had been in the Jesuits before they were suppressed, and then he became a diocesan priest, was the first bishop and later Archbishop of the United States of America. So Charles Carroll of Carrollton, actually many of his personal holdings were then given to what became the District of Columbia. Carroll of Carrollton, particularly close with George Washington, and during the first presidential election was encouraged to run for president. We're going to see in a minute how the president's selected. Whoever gets the most votes is president, whoever gets the second is elected vice president. But Carroll, so committed to Maryland and the importance of the state and the business of the state, of which at that point Maryland, key harbor, key economic generator, says now where my interest and where my leadership needs to be is in my state of Maryland. So during his lifetime, he goes from being the wealthiest and most influential, focusing on his local issue. He's the last of the signers of the Declaration to die. And at that time, almost completely politically insignificant. Interesting person. All right, Section 9.
The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation not exceeding $10 for each person. The privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, unless when in the cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. No bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. No capitation or other direct tax shall be laid, unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. No tax or duty shall be laid on articles exported from any state. No preference shall be given by any regulation of commerce or revenue to the ports of one state over those of another, nor shall vessels bound to or from one state be obliged to enter, clear, or pay duties in another. No money shall be drawn from the treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. No title of nobility shall be granted by the United States, and no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of Congress, accept of any present emolument, office, or title of any kind whatsoever from any king, prince, or foreign state.
All right, so that issue of nobility, again, they're just gone through revolution. The last thing they want is to see a king rise up. They don't want to see foreign nations involved in our domestic. So they're saying no honorifics in that regard. Let's go to our attorneys in the room. Mr. Zita, maybe you can help us with this one. Writ of habeas corpus, what is it?
It's a document signed by a judge requiring that police or other authorities produce an individual that has been arrested for whatever reason. Meaning that you can't, the police can't just arrest somebody, hide them away in the jail, and never bring them to to a judge or to a court in order to have due process.
Due process. So someone has to be representing the rights of the citizen and saying, all right, we're just not going to grab you because you're politically inexpedient to us or we want to punish you. There has to be a reasonable aspect of why you're suspected of committing this crime. How about the bill of attainder? You want to take a whack at that, Fabio?
I'm more familiar with the ex post facto law.
All right, give
if
us
I may.
ex post facto.
Yeah, ex post facto means you can't enact a law for someone's behavior that occurred prior to the law, in order to punish that person. I imagine that was one of the problems that was existing in the colonies at the time of British rule, and so they wanted to get rid of that. So same thing with the question of writ of habeas corpus, right? And in fact, the only time I believe that the writ of habeas corpus was exercised on a wide scale was during the Civil War when Lincoln jailed people, and kept them in jail without due process.
Okay. Bill of attainder basically says?
A bill of attainder is somebody being convicted of a crime, but not by a judge and due process in a court, but rather by action of some legislative body, like the Congress or state legislature, something like that. In other words, no trial, no evidence.
Somebody's not politically expedient, the majority say those guys are bad, go arrest them. Okay, got it. All right, so now we're moving into section 10.
No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, abit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law or law impairing the obligations of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. No state shall, without the consent of the Congress, lay any imposts or duties on imports or exports, except what may be absolutely necessary for executing its inspection laws, and the net produce of all duties and imposts laid by the state on imports or exports shall be for the use of the Treasury of the United States, and all such laws shall be subject to the revision and control of the Congress. No state shall, without the consent of Congress, lay any duty of tonnage, keep troops or ships of war in time of peace, enter into any agreement or compact with another state or with a foreign power, or engage in war unless actually invaded or in such immediate danger as will not admit of delay.
All right, so they're saying here, look, states have certain responsibilities, but this is a federal government. We have certain responsibilities and obligations. As a result, we don't want individual states contracting negotiations with foreign countries. They can't be utilizing their own form of currency or money. Remember, printing money was very difficult in that particular time. A lot of what happened in terms of the way people transacted business was done with barter or on letters of credit that were then put into a bank. We didn't have a national banking system, so there were local regional banks. And so trying to control the economics of the country was not easy to do. So they're laying out the vision for what will become a national economic and commerce with foreign nations. Remember, there's no income tax at this particular time. So the way the federal government raised its money was through duties that were put on for imports from other countries. So for example, Great Britain had a great manufacturing base. They were able to make things relatively inexpensively, and so they could ship them across the country even though the shipping had tremendous cost. But it would be competitive with our local industry, particularly in the northern mercantile states, where maybe it costs more for them to manufacture. So a way to equal the playing field was to put a tariff or a duty on that import. And then when we come into the ports, the duty would have to be paid after the the manifest was checked to make sure that it was. Smuggling, big issue at this particular time. We have a big coastline, we don't have a lot of Coast Guard. So a lot of smuggling is taking place, and so this is a way for the Congress to try and be able to rein all that in. Okay, those are the responsibilities of the legislature. Now let's go into Article 2. We're going to be dealing with the executive power, and this is, again, 3 co-equal branches. We're going to be dealing with the executive now. What's the responsibility of the executive? Emmerich?
The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. He shall hold his office during the term of 4 years, and together with the Vice President, chosen for the same term, be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives, to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. But no senator or representative or person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector. The electors shall meet in their respective states and vote by ballot for 2 persons, of whom one at least shall not be an inhabitant of the same state with themselves. And they shall make a list of all the persons voted for and of the number of votes for each, which lists they shall sign and certify, and transmit sealed to the seat of the government of the United States, directed to the President of the Senate. The President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President. If such number be a majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if there be more than one who have such majority and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose by ballot one of them for President. And if no person have a majority, then from the 5 highest on the list, the said House shall in like manner choose a President. But in choosing the President, the votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote. A quorum for this purpose shall consist of a member or members from 2/3 of the states, and a majority of all the Senate's states shall be necessary to a choice. In every case, after the choice of the President, the person having the greatest number of votes of the electors shall be the Vice President. But if there should remain 2 or more who have equal votes, the Senate shall choose from them by ballot the Vice President. The Congress may determine the time of choosing the electors and the day on which they shall give their votes, which day shall be the same throughout the United States. No person except a natural-born citizen or a citizen of the United States at the time of adoption of this Constitution shall be eligible to the office of the President. Neither shall any person be eligible to that office who shall not have attained to the age of 35 years and been 14 years a resident with the United States. In case of the removal of the President from the office, or of his death, resignation, or inability to discharge the powers and duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the Vice President, and the Congress may by law provide for the case of removal, death, resignation, or inability, both of the President and Vice President, declaring what officer shall then act as President, and such officer shall act accordingly until a disability be removed, or a President shall be elected. The President shall, at stated times, receive for his services a compensation which shall neither be increased nor diminished during the period for which he shall have been elected. And he shall not receive within that period any other emolument from the United States or any of them. Before he enter on the execution of his office, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
All right, so section 1 is dealing with how the president is elected. Is he elected by direct democracy, or is he by an electoral college? Electoral college. And the purpose of the electoral college was to create some semblance of balance or equality for the states, because some states had a greater population than others, and yet the states' rights needed to be preserved and protected. So in that regard, the Electoral College was something that was created to create as much balance as they could in that part, and has continued on through this time period. That's why California, with its huge population, I think we have 54 electoral votes of the last census, might be 56, has a weighted advantage, but at the same token, only 2 senators. Wyoming, which has 2 senators but only 1 representative. So again, it's a way to try and balance the issues of the states, but yet still provide for the population where people happen to be located. Section 2.
The President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States and of the militia of the several states. When called into actual service of the United States, he may require the opinion, in writing, of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. He shall have power, and by and with the advice of the consent of the state, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur. He shall nominate, and by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, shall appoint ambassadors, other public ministers and counsels, judges of the Supreme Court, and all other officers of the United States, whose appointments are not herein otherwise provided for, and which shall be established by law. But the Congress may, by law, vest the appointment of such inferior officers as they think proper, in the President alone, in the courts of the law, or in the heads of departments. The President shall have the power to fill up all vacancies that may happen during the recess of Senate by granting commissions, which shall expire at the end of their next session.
Okay, so the President has tremendous authority and leniency in executing the business of the United States. However, the Senate plays a role of advice and consent. So that means the President needs to consult with the Senate, particularly when naming people into his cabinet and his ambassadors, et cetera. And we see this played out recently in the recent cabinet appointments for President Trump, and the battle during the hearings and back and forth. So the Senate has a particular role in helping the President, but at the same token, the President, tremendous authority in executing his responsibilities. Section 3.
He shall from time to time give the Congress information of the state of the Union and recommend to their consideration such measures as he shall judge necessarily and expedient. He may on extraordinary occasions convene both houses or either of them, and in case of disagreement between them with respect to the time of adjournment, he may adjourn them to such time as he shall think proper. He shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. He shall take care that the laws be faithful executed, and shall commission all the officers of the United States.
Okay, so the President has tremendous authority in terms of the military office. He's in charge of commissioning the officers, but he's got a responsibility to dialogue with both the House and the Senate. Okay, Section 4.
The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors.
Okay, very broad statement, high crimes and misdemeanors. Okay, a lot of latitude in terms of what that is or isn't, and it's to the House and the Senate to agree what that is, but the President ultimately has a check and balance in him through impeachment. Okay, so that deals with the executive. So we've dealt with the legislative, we've dealt with the House and the Senate, we've talked about the executive. Now we have the third co-equal branch of government, Article 3.
The judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior courts as the Congress may from time to time ordain and establish. The judges both of the Supreme and inferior courts shall hold their offices during good behavior and shall at stated times receive for their services a compensation which shall not be diminished during their continuance in office.
Section 2.
The judicial power shall extend to all cases in law and equity arising under this Constitution, the laws of the United States, and treaties made or which shall be made under their authority, to all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, to all cases of admiralty and maritime jurisdiction, to controversies to which the United States shall be a party, to controversies between two or more states, between a state and citizens of another state, between citizens of different states, between citizens of the same state claiming lands under grants of different states, and between a state or the citizens thereof and foreign states, citizens or subjects. In all cases affecting ambassadors, other public ministers, and consuls, and those in which a state shall be party, the Supreme Court shall have original jurisdiction. In all other cases before mentioned, the Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make. The trial of all crimes, except in cases of impeachment, shall be by jury, and such trial shall be held in the state where the said crime shall have been committed. But when not committed within any state, the trial shall be at such place or places as the Congress may by law have directed.
Okay, so we're laying out the federal judiciary in terms of how it operates. We're saying that there will be federal courts in the local states so that people don't have to go all the way to a central place in order to be heard, but there is ultimately a final appeal process of the Supreme Court that will determine what is and isn't. So as a citizen, even though you're being pushed politically, you have the opportunity to redress these issues. Section 3.
Treason against the United States shall consist in leaving war against them or in adhering to their enemies, giving them aid and comfort. No person shall be convicted of treason unless on the testimony of 2 witnesses to the same overt act or on confession in an open court. The Congress shall have power to declare the punishment of treason, but no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture except during the life of the person attainted.
Okay, so they're dealing with issues of treason, those that would try to overthrow or assist in the overthrow of the government. Probably in our history, the thing that's most relevant is the Civil War, because here you have the states that are saying, hey, we didn't sign up on this Constitution for you to usurp our individual rights, right? And so they're saying we can leave. We freely joined, we can freely leave. The union is saying, no, it's a union, and once you're in, and we're going to preserve the union. So there's this tension at work, and that ends up being the Civil War, which ends up becoming a huge cost in terms of blood and treasure and fraternal discord. One of the interesting things in terms of Section 2 and Section 3, so there was a man by the name of Robert Edward Lee who was our most proficient Army officer prior to the Civil War. He was offered the command of the Union troops during the Civil War because he was held in such high respect. And while he believed in the Union, he said, I cannot draw my sword against my state, and so he resigned his commission, and then he reported back to his state, which was Virginia, where he had an estate, and he waited to be called upon, at which point he was, and ultimately was put in charge of the Army of Northern Virginia after a couple of other assignments. And then he ended up basically being in command of the Confederate troops, although they didn't have a real central command like we might understand them. As a result, treasonous act, he's in rebellion, he's the poster child for rebellion. During the Union's invasion of Virginia, Lee's home is then taken. It's taken as military headquarters, and then his front yard is utilized as a cemetery for the Union dead. Okay, so if you've ever been to Arlington National Cemetery, you'll see Lee House there on the hill. And so that property was seized, and then it was on purpose turned into a cemetery so that the Lee family would never be able to go back and take control of their estate again. Now, what do you do if you're an heir to that property which was seized by the government and then rendered inhospitable? So the heirs of Robert E. Lee then sued the federal government for compensation for the fact that their home had been taken by force and there was never any remuneration. And so over years and years, ultimately arriving at the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court ruled for the Lee family, so that the federal government had to give compensation for the land that they had sealed during that rebellion. This is the beauty of this Supreme Court, that there is always an opportunity to appeal. If you lose at the lower court, you can appeal. If you lose at the lower, you can appeal. And ultimately, it is the Supreme Court to determine what is or is not constitutional, what is not therefore just. And so even in a case of treason where we went through the Civil War, still the rights of property are upheld in our courts of law. This should give all of us, particularly when they're the political minority, for example, pro-lifers, in a state where you have a legislature that is overwhelmingly in support of lack of rights for the unborn, that we can have the ability to fight the good fight and know that we're still protected in our individual rights. For example, the right to assemble, the right for free speech, okay? So we went through the first 3 articles of the Constitution. The first one deals with what? Legislative. Second one deals with what? Executive. Third one deals with what? Judiciary. 3 co-equal branches of government. Now we're in a very interesting time period where, due to the election, we have a very interesting thing that's lined up. You have one party that's in charge of the Senate. You have one party that's in charge of the House. So 1/3 of that branch of government is controlled by one political party. And then because of the presidential election, a member of that same party now has responsibility for the executive. So 2/3 of the branches of government are in control by that one party. And while the judiciary is non-political, it's political in the sense that the president has the ability to appoint the Supreme Court justices. And the current president appointed 3 during his first term. So we're watching a very interesting lining up where a party that has been in the majority for a great period of the last 75 years is now finding themselves in the political minority. And the party that's in the majority is looking at this as an opportunity to right what they believe are some of the redresses that have, or redress some of the issues that have been occurred over the 70 years. So you're going to see things in your lifetime, in your time right now, that are being fought out politically that have tremendous consequences for the future of our country. The next time period where there's going to be an opportunity for the citizens of this country to do something about that will be in 2 years when the midterm elections happen. Now, typically what will happen in a midterm election after the president's been elected, the party that's in the majority in the executive usually loses in the midterm elections. That's typical. If you look back historically what happens. But we're living in very atypical time periods. That's by no means a given. But it's the opportunity for the political minority to win back at least some ability to push back against the executive power. So we're going to be looking at tremendously day to day over these next 100, 200 days, a lot of political action because the president has tremendous authority in the executive branch. So you have to be paying attention, watch your news, see how it's going to impact you. It's going to impact you lives of these young guys when you're starting your businesses, when you're going to work, all of the issues that have to do with economics, all of that's being worked out right now. And you're seeing things like tariffs. When have we ever had tariffs? For the last 40 years, we've been pursuing a policy of a tariff-free environment, free trade. Well, now we're seeing a complete 180-degree position and sort of saying, hey, we're going to use tariffs to execute foreign policy. Some of it for economic benefit for our local manufacturers. Others are to punish people who are not, in the opinion of the current president, saying you're not dealing fairly with us in terms of certain foreign affairs. Therefore, we're going to penalize your economy through tariffs. I'm not going to say what is right or what is wrong, et cetera. I'm just saying this is where we are in terms of the current political reality. I can't remember when the last time we've had the Senate, the House, and the executive, except right after the 9/11. That was for a very short period of time, and that was during extraordinary times because the country had been attacked through terrorism. But when you look back over the last 70 years, we really haven't seen a situation where the government's been this united in 2/3 of the branches. Now again, when the Constitution was written, there weren't really political parties. George Washington was elected the first president, was not. He was a Federalist in terms of his beliefs, but he wasn't part of a party. And then he was reelected for a second term, wasn't part of a party. His vice president was John Adams, okay? So John Adams was the first person who became partisan, who was part of what was known as the Federalist Party. His opponent was our third president, was Thomas Jefferson, who had a completely different, he was part of what was called the Republican Democrats. And they had much more of an attitude of the states are where the authority needs to be. We don't want a big centralized government. And so this really begins the give and take of what we now call as modern politics between partisanship, which we now have obviously Republicans and Democrats. So over that 200 period of times, the parties change a couple of times in terms of their beliefs, who's involved, et cetera. Current Republican Party was really established in 1856. I think our standard bearer at that time period was John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, who lost. And then in 1860, through a very contentious multi-party election that ultimately ended up with a minority candidate being the president in terms of electors, and that guy's name was Abraham Lincoln. So he was the first Republican elected to president, and then that obviously set off the tone, which became the Civil War. The Civil War then ends. Now we have occupation in terms of Reconstruction, and it just really bleeds the country for really until the First World War. And it wasn't until after the Great Depression that the South rose economically again through the mass migration of taking northern people down to the South for training for the war. After the Great Depression, there was a big migration. Crazy thing. Prior to the Second World War, standing army of 375,000 people. By the end of the Second World War, just 5 years later, 16 million men had been brought into the service, had been outfitted, had been trained, had been fed, had been deployed to the various battlefields. So this is probably the greatest mass mobilization of humanity in the history of the country. And that's how quickly the United States was able to pivot. And that created a great deal of social change because during the previous 10 years prior to the Second World War, what was going on economically in the country? Nobody went anywhere, couldn't afford it. People are on the farm, 30% of the people still made their living on the farm. People stayed on the farm, they didn't go anywhere, so they didn't know anybody. So if you got a Brooklyn Jew who loves the Brooklyn Dodgers, who's been sent down to Shreveport, Louisiana for training, who's now sitting next to a guy that was from, I don't know, Mississippi, and they're in the barracks for the first time, they're starting to have commonality in terms of their purpose and finding out, you know what, these guys aren't as bad as I thought. And so this is what begins the change in our country in terms of not only economics and mobilization, but in terms of general civil rights and attitudes. Again, don't discount the importance of air conditioning, because once the South became habitable, then again, mass migrations and what we see now in terms of the Sun Belt and the tremendous growth in the southern states of Florida, Carolinas, Georgia, all the Gulf resorts, Louisiana, things that are on there. Texas, exactly. So again, we're seeing a lot of changes in terms of people picking up, moving. So many of our good pro-lifers here in Orange County have moved out of state. It's really made it difficult for us politically. But again, it doesn't mean we give up the fight. We still have to represent, even though we're in the micro minority. All right, so a lot to cover for a morning session. Any questions, thoughts, issues before we kind of wrap? Mr. Zito?
I just wanted to suggest to everybody to consider, it was an excellent summary of our history there, Mark. Thank you for that. But it's not just, these are not issues, you read the Constitution and then it's dry and it's boring as all get out, right? But it has consequences right today. And we as Catholics have to think about what is our responsibility as American Catholics given what we're doing. We've got a situation now where we have a president and an administration that is really, in many senses, ignoring parts of the Constitution. And the effect of that is very dire on lots of people. There are people who are starving children who are going to die because they're not getting food that the Congress appropriated for them. There are AIDS sufferers who are going to die because they're not getting medicines that the Congress appropriated for them. There are immigrants who are being terrorized. There are veterans who are losing their jobs and not getting their health care. So this is all concrete consequences on regular people like us that result from this. So it's not just a case of, civics class. This has real consequences for us, and we have to think about what is our responsibility as Catholics in the face of these consequences that are happening to regular people. So I just offer that up as something to consider, not just from a political standpoint, but from our faith. It's a challenge to our faith. How do we respond when these kinds of consequences are being visited on real life people in our name?
So we asked the question in Genesis, am I my brother's keeper? And what was the answer? Yes, right? Now, as Catholics in the United States of America, at the time period that this document, we were in the micro minority and had been persecuted prevented from holding office in many of the states. Even in Maryland, which was founded as a Catholic colony, fell under Protestant majority, and so Catholics were prevented from holding office even in their own state. It's not the case today. There was Catholic ascendancy in our country during the Second World War, where over 25% of the people in the armed services were Catholics. That was a time period where they answered the nation's call, they enrolled in the services, and that was a time period where all of a sudden Catholics weren't seen as this strange bugaboo anymore, because we had lived in a Protestant majority, particularly an Anglican and Methodist and Presbyterian majority in our country. And so it was the first time that Catholics interacted with a lot of people. In that time period since the Second World War, Catholics have become in the ascendant in terms of legislative, in terms of executive. Gosh, we've got Catholics in the majority on the Supreme Court. We've got Catholics all over the legislature. We've got Catholics in charge of our executive branches. Even in the vice president is a Catholic convert. But again, this is where this tension of our faith and our citizenship is going to come into play. But again, we're not a faith of hierarchy in terms of the Pope tells us what to do. It's from subsidiarity, so we have individual responsibilities when we meet God at the pearly gates of how did you do with the things that we were entrusted to, your wife, your family, your children, your place of business, your vote, and did we take care of the immigrant that's here illegally, that's living in fear of being deported, the person who doesn't have access to health care, the person who is unjustly under threat because he's not yet born and those rights aren't existing, the woman who's has an unplanned pregnancy and is afraid. All of these issues we deal with all the time in real time, real person and people in our lives. And so that's where Mr. Z is absolutely correct. We as Catholics need to not only know our faith, we also need to know our citizenship rights and more importantly, responsibilities. And we need to be present when these two things are in tension.